Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Marin. I'm the Dean of Law at UNB. We begin all of our events by recognizing and respectfully acknowledging that the UNB law community gathers on the unsurrendered and unceded traditional lands of Wolastoqiyik. I also want to thank the International Law Society at UNB Law for organizing this event, which has become an annual one, and we're very proud of our students for putting this on. So it's my privilege to welcome you all to our faculty, and in particular our special guest, the Honorable Bob Rae, Canada's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the United Nations in New York. Ambassador Rae is a wonderful role model for all aspiring lawyers. He's had a spectacular career dedicated to public service. He's a Rhodes Scholar with degrees in modern history, politics, and law. He was former Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995, and interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada from 2011 to 2013. He's also represented Canada internationally in many different roles, for instance, serving as special envoy to Myanmar and special envoy on humanitarian and refugee issues. He was also a partner at OKT LLP, specializing in Indigenous law and constitutional issues. And Ambassador Rae, there's actually a connection between OKT and UNB Law because Renee Pelletier, the firm's managing partner, teaches a course in our faculty on land claims and self-government agreements. And we're very grateful for the expertise that she's brought to our faculty. Ambassador Rae has numerous awards and distinctions recognizing his outstanding contribution to society. He's a Privy Councillor, a Companion of the Order of Canada, and member of the Order of Ontario. So Ambassador Rae, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope one day we'll be able to do this in person so you can visit our campus, preferably in the fall. I think this is absolutely the right format for middle of February, but in the fall is a fantastic place to visit in person. So we're honored to have you, and I'll over to Rachel Lauder, who's the president of our International Law Society, to begin the dialogue. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
I accept your invitation, Dean. I'd be delighted to come up.
Wonderful.
No, I'm not. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dean Marin. Can everybody hear me? I'm okay. Awesome. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. We have students, lawyers, public servants, and more joining us from all over. So this is a very, very exciting event. Again, Ambassador Rae, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. It's always a pleasure. As per Ambassador Rae's request, this is going to be a really interactive session. So the first half of the event is going to be more of an interview style presentation. I'll be posing some questions to Ambassador Rae. And then we will open it up for a general Q&A in the second half. So please think about your questions and save them until that second half. I will also note that usually if you experience any technical issues, it is helpful to have your camera off. It doesn't impact the streaming as much. Obviously, Ambassador Rae and myself will keep ours on. And if we do experience any technical issues, please just remain calm. It's always helpful to log off and then rejoin the link, but we are hopeful that that won't be an issue. So without further ado, Ambassador Rae, recently in July 2020, as everyone knows, you were appointed Canada's United Nations Ambassador and Permanent Representative. Can you speak a bit about what this role means, what it involves, and what are Canada's current priorities at the United Nations?
For me, it meant an opportunity to bring together a lot of my own experiences and skill set, as you say, and also an opportunity to represent Canada on the world stage. The UN is a stage, in a sense. It's in part a place where issues are joined and where fundamental issues are debated. Critics of the UN will say, yeah, a lot of things are debated, not a lot gets decided. And that's not an unfair criticism. It's the reality of what the institution is. But there are things that are decided as well, areas in which Canada can play a critical role on peace building and peacekeeping in the discussions around COVID-19, which are very much still in play because of the impact not only on people's health, but also on the economy. So that's been very much a preoccupation and a priority for me, together with climate change, which is the Paris Agreement is a UN treaty. So the UN remains a very important operating arm of the discussions that take place among scientists and among countries and nation states. So as well as Canada's underlying commitment to the rule of law and to multilateralism, this really is we're at a critical juncture where democratic governments and governments that are committed to the rule of law, that are committed to accepting the limits of their power and to the fact that there will always be somebody judging them from above their behavior has to be in line with morals and with legal principles, which is very much an underlying value and principle of Canadian life and of Canadian domestic policy and also Canadian foreign policy. We're here at a critical time. I mean, every time is a critical time, but this is the moment that we're in. So all of these things are keeping me very busy, very occupied, very engaged with other countries and with my fellow Canadians. I bring to the job a political background, which some will criticize, but I think has its benefits in understanding that the UN is also a political institution. It's one that functions the way every parliament functions, or the way every deliberative body functions. And some of the basic skill sets that you learn as a politician. I was in politics for 30 years, one way, shape, or form. So that's helped me. I think it's been a plus. And also the fact that public diplomacy is a very important part of my job. I'm talking to you. I talk to Canadians and I talk to people around the world. I have a very active Twitter account, which sometimes gets criticized, but I try to be objective, occasionally pushing the needles a bit, but trying to get people to understand that this is not some remote activity. It's taking place in the heart of world politics. And of course, views will be expressed and other views will be expressed. And that's part of the international dialogue that we have to be part of as Canadians.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So the next question, as you noted, you've had a prominent career in politics, but as Dean Marin mentioned, prior to that, you work at senior counsel at OKT. And so recently, Canada adopted and ratified the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a treaty that aims to promote Indigenous well-being globally. So from your experiences working in Aboriginal law and now at the UN, what does it mean for Canada to ratify this agreement? And do you think it will influence truth and reconciliation efforts domestically?
The short answer to the last question is yes. I think it will. I think it is changing the nature of the discussion in Canada and around the world. I think it puts us clearly in the context of history. We share an experience with a number of other countries around the world of the relationship between, if you like, exploring and settling countries and Indigenous people. That is a major disruption in world history that has gone from time to time, but most recently in the last 600 years has been a dominant event and a common event. And as with many other historical transformations, for a long time we denied what was going on, or we denied the nature of the change, the transformation that was taking place. And in the darkest moments in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, we not only denied it, but we celebrated the fact that quote, the forces of civilization were dominating, quote, the forces of savagery, which was how it was described in many contemporary accounts and in many laws that were passed, and ways in which imperial and colonizing countries were able to maintain their domination and their power. I think in the last 50 years, since decolonization really started at the United Nations, I think that had a huge impact on how we have had to respond to those events and how we've had to make them part of our own realization. I think Canadians became more and more aware of their colonial life, of the fact that this is the tide of history of which we are very much a part, and we're not cut off from the experiences of other countries. The Prime Minister gave a speech at the UN in 2016, which I still encourage people to read, because when he made that speech, it was quite unusual. As Prime Minister, he was essentially telling the UN General Assembly, you might think of us as being this kind of a country, but actually we're this kind of a country. We're a country with an Indigenous reality, an Indigenous presence, and a colonial past that we are trying better to understand and trying to come to grips with. And the speech had quite an impact on the Assembly, because I think it was, I mean, no Canadian Prime Minister had given a similar speech before. The United American president has never given a speech like that here, the Australian Prime Minister or the New Zealand Prime Minister. Now the New Zealanders would do it more. The Mexicans, yes. Many Latin American countries, yes, a bit. But I think it's had an impact, because we continue to say to other countries, we're not coming at this when we talk about human rights, or we talk about the universality of certain legal principles. We're not coming at this from a situation of purity. We're coming at this from a situation where we're part of this struggle. This is an internal struggle for Canada. And I think that has allowed us to develop a relationship with other countries that we would not otherwise have had. Very candid one, very open, very transparent, where we discuss these issues in a very direct way. And I do think that the adoption of UNDRIP by the government of Canada and the legislation being passed, I do think it clearly situates Canada, which is where we belong, which is in the world. We're not claiming any Canadian exceptionalism. Some countries might. The United States often talks about its exceptional position, or the exceptional position of American democracy. I think these are actually bad ideas. I think it's wrong for anyone to think that we're all exceptional, but none of us are exceptional. And that's the kind of the tension that we live with as human beings every day. But we should understand that we are deeply immersed in this history, and we're going through it now. And I did have an extraordinary opportunity for 7 years prior to coming here to teaching Indigenous law at the University of Toronto, and also engaging in negotiations with the federal government on behalf of Indigenous people, which was a very, very important experience for me as a human being, because it allowed me to learn new things. It also forced me to think more about my country and its history and its present, which is always a good thing to do.
Thank you so much for those thoughtful remarks. So speaking of Canada's role and presence internationally, prior to your appointment at the United Nations, you served as Canada's Special Envoy to Myanmar, in which you wrote a report on your findings called "Tell Them We're Human." Can you speak a bit about the country's unraveling situation and the recommendations you made to Canada and the international community to help Myanmar?
Yeah, I mean, all these questions could be the subject of a long lecture, which I'll try not to give. But again, it was a very powerful experience for me. I was appointed in 2017, right after the expulsion of the 1 million Rohingya refugees to Bangladesh. And I had been as I founded a little NGO, or a very small but mighty NGO called the Forum of Federations. And in the course of that work, I had actually spent a bit of time in Myanmar, engaging with the country's leaders on the nature of federalism globally, and why the federal model might make sense for Myanmar. And so I knew some of the leaders. I met Aung San Suu Kyi. I'd had some discussions with other ethnic leaders. And I think that's why the Prime Minister appointed me. And it's again, every country is the product of its history. The people of Myanmar, Burma, it's a multi-ethnic country with one dominant ethnic group, the Bamar population, the Burmese population, which live in the center of the country, around the great river, the Irrawaddy, which goes through the center of the country. And that ancient civilization has seen itself as being, the country. And the British, when they came in, they basically decapitated the monarchy and cut them out of the country and got rid of the traditional structures that were in play. And I think they did that not necessarily knowing what they were doing or what impact it would have. So when the Myanmar nationalism came back, Burmese nationalism, to get rid of the empire, get rid of the Brits, the argument they used was Burma for the Burmese, which globally seemed to mean, well, the Burmese people want to take control of their country, which is a good thing. But internally, a lot of people interpret it to mean, no, Burma for the Burmese, not for all these ethnic groups that live in the broad periphery of the country. And so that was the tension at the core of the country's independence, and that tension never left. And the people who were more impacted by that than anybody else were the Rohingya, because they were seen as being at the very bottom of the social spectrum. I heard some terrible racist comments about the Rohingya people in Yangon when I was just in a cab, get into a cab, and they'd say, "What are you doing here?" I'd say, "Oh, I'm here to talk about the Rohingya." And they would say, "Who are they? Who are they? You mean the Bengalis?" He said, They don't count here. They're not here. They're not one of us." And that was a very widespread sentiment. So you had all the features of xenophobia, racism, the internal conflict there. And essentially what I tried to do in my report, which was give a bit of a history of what had happened, and also to explain that we have a refugee crisis in Bangladesh, which we need to continue to address. We have a continuing war going on inside the country, which at that time was much less than what's happening today. And Canada needs to be able to respond to these things in a thoughtful and constructive way, which I think the government, then took it up and said, we will start to do it. But my work was then transformed into a broader discussion about the overall refugee and humanitarian system globally because of the changes that are underway. And that was intensified by COVID. So coming here, it's been very much part of my discussion. I had a meeting yesterday. After this meeting today, I'm going to lunch with the head of the International Office on Migration, and principally to talk about not just what's happening with the Rohingya, although that'd be part of it, but what's happening elsewhere. Because the conflicts in the world have created far more displacement. Some refugees, some migrants, one kind and another, some staying in the country, some leaving the country, which has created enormous tensions around the world, which we're wrestling with all the time. And New Brunswickers know that ethnic and linguistic tensions are a real thing. And I think as Canadians, we understand it. And we have to continually try to overcome them and to transcend them and to appreciate them. But they can cause great conflict. We saw this in the relationship between settlers and Indigenous people in Canadian history, Atlantic history, New Brunswick history. We see it in the expulsion of the Acadians, which is not dissimilar at all from the expulsion of the Rohingyas. It's the same argument. The Acadians are not part of the British Empire, so goodbye, you're gone. And that's left a scar that is still there. And I think we, as Canadians, we I think should, if we understand our history and our makeup, should appreciate that these struggles exist everywhere. We're part of it. And secondly, that we can overcome them. We don't have to. We're not the prisoners of our past. We can choose our own future, as Prime Minister Laurier used to say very eloquently, talking about Canadian politics.
Absolutely. I love that notion of not being prisoners of our past. So thank you so much for that. Another area of concern in the world right now that a lot of people are paying attention to is the threat of Russia invading the Ukraine, which I imagine you've had quite a number of discussions on at the United Nations. So right now, there are threats of national sovereignty, internationally recognized borders. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a bit about what the atmosphere is like concerning this right now at the United Nations in New York, and what challenges or limitations, if any, is the United Nations facing when dealing with this crisis?
Well, to come to your last point first, I mean, the real challenge facing the UN since its formation in 1945 has been the fact that we are an organization dedicated to the rule of law. We're also an organization that gave itself a structure that ennobles, if I may use that word, power politics, because the five powers that supposedly won the war gave themselves a veto over peace and security issues in the Security Council. So you give the authority for resolving peace and security to the Security Council, then you say the five permanent members of the Security Council have a veto over everything the Security Council does. Well, Russia is chairing the Security Council this month. The chair rotates every month, and Russia is the chair in the month of February. So you have a potential aggressor chairing the Security Council that is supposed to be able to deal with issues of peace and security. So there are contradictions at the heart of the UN. And these contradictions have sometimes sidelined the United Nations from being able to be the place that actually responds to the crisis. The UN was not able to stop the war in Vietnam. The UN has not been able to stop a number of conflicts, invariably because one of the powers, in the case of Vietnam, it was the Americans. In the case of other conflicts, it's been the Russians or the Chinese or someone else. The Brits tried to do it, the French tried to do it over Suez, but they were eventually disabled from doing that, which was a major event in 1956. But there's a lot of incursions against sovereign nations that have taken place without any ability on the part of the Security Council to pass a resolution. Security Council was not able to pass a resolution since I've been here on Myanmar, incapable of doing it because the Russians and the Chinese said, if you try to pass one, we will veto it. So you can't do it. So the UN's role is sometimes frustrating, but at the same time, the UN is a place where everybody gets together. So I've been on the phone over the last while with the Ukrainian ambassador. The Russian ambassador has not been well, so I haven't spoken to him personally, but we do talk to all of the countries in the region. We do engage obviously with our capital in Ottawa on a regular basis, saying, what do you know? What are you finding out? What are you hearing? And the UN is a central kind of sounding board for some of these discussions. But we're not by no means the only place where this happens. And in that sense, the UN is not actually at the center of the issue, which is frustrating. And I think for many who look at the UN Charter and say, well, wait a minute, it says here, you can't invade another country. So if the Russians do that, they're going contrary to the Charter. You say, yes, they are. No question. Absolutely no doubt about it. If they were to do that, that would be the case. When they took Crimea illegally. There's no legal basis for their occupation of Crimea. But de facto, hey, they've got the power, which is why I say the central contradiction at the heart of the UN itself is the idea of the rule of law and the idea of power politics. And many times these things clash. And that's the tension that we live with every day. And we're certainly living with it over the Ukrainian issue, no question.
Thank you so much. So I guess switching to a bit of a more collaborative, possibly happier note, building upon the Millennial Development Goals, the United Nations General Assembly introduced the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, being a universal call to action to eradicate global poverty, achieve gender equality, tackle climate change, and much more. So we're just wondering if you can speak a bit about, since you've been there, how Canada is contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. Last week, of course, was International Development Week, and as well wondering how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted achieving the SDGs, which is meant to wrap up in 2030.
Well, first of all, they've it's a real challenge. COVID and climate change are a real challenge to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I think one has to say is the challenge that we have had collectively of creating a truly viable path towards a sustainable economy and societies around the world. I think the SDGs are incredibly important because they are a really significant expression of the desire for a democratic, sustainable, prosperous future for the world. And it's a global vision for that. And it's an expression of our support for the institutions that help to make it happen and help to allow it to develop. And so to me, they're an extremely important expression of global aspiration, which I think is very powerful and very meaningful for Canadians. Because if you were to ask Canadians, what do you want for yourselves or for your children, regardless of partisan background, I mean, there will be different emphases, but everyone would accept that we don't want people living in poverty. We want kids to get educated. We want women to survive childbirth. We want kids to survive infancy. We want a better world. We want people with access to education. We want the rule of law. We want fair resolution of disputes. And that's the aspiration. And it's a much more meaningful expression of that than perhaps even in the Charter, because the Charter talks in much more general terms about the rule of law and about social and economic cooperation. There are parts of the Charter that are quite clear about the ongoing role of the UN in improving the condition of the world. But the SDGs builds on that and is much more explicit about how that's going to happen. We have to recognize, I said at the beginning, that COVID and climate change have really forced us back because of the drastic impact of COVID globally. It's been the most serious setback for the global economy and for global health since the Second World War. And so I don't think we've fully understood the global dimensions of the COVID crisis. I think we still, in a lot of our national discussions, we still look upon it as either a Canadian issue or an American issue or a British issue or as a national issue, when really, in real terms, it's not a national issue. It's a global pandemic, which requires a global response. And in the absence of an effective global response, and one has to say the global response has not been as effective and as robust as various national responses have been, we will face a tremendous problem with the global recovery. And the global recovery has everything to do with giving us the means to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So we will be engaging with a discussion about the SDGs for long past 2030. And I think we all need to come to grips with that this is a journey we're all on, and it's going to take combined efforts to get there.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there is no shortage of work in this field. So my last question for you, just before we open it up to the rest of the audience, considering your various experiences and everything that we've discussed today, what advice do you have for anyone on this call, but particularly students and young professionals, such as myself, who are really passionate about pursuing a career in international law, development, and foreign affairs?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity. It can be a little frustrating because, I mean, the traditional path for lawyers is you go and work for a private law firm and you get clients and you make your living, and that's how you operate. So it's a little hard to do it out of that base. I mean, if you're just looking at it as a law student, it's not a kind of well-trodden path. But if you look more broadly and you say to yourself, well, law is really a training for a lot of things, and not everybody has to be a lawyer, but even those who've gone to law school, you can say, well, I actually want to use the skills that I've learned and the education that I've had and apply it in a slightly different way. The opportunities are very big when you think that way, because you've got all of the UN agencies, all of the global institutions from a governmental point of view. You've also got in the private sector, both in the NGO community and even in business, you've got a substantial interest in thinking more globally and thinking not just at a national level. And even on the business side, there's much greater interest in corporate social responsibility. Well, okay, we're going to open a mine in country X. How are we going to behave? How are we going to treat the population? How are we going to become known as a good corporate citizen of the country in which we're operating? And there will be UN rules and regulations that will increasingly impact on how you respond to that, as well as there's work for the Canadian government and become a diplomat. So there's lots of opportunities for people, but you just have to be prepared to think about it a little more broadly than perhaps the traditional focus would lead you. And I do think that that perception about what going to law school is all about is changing now. I think it is. I think increasingly people understand that you won't necessarily become a practicing lawyer in a commercial practice. That's not the only thing you can do with your law degree, and that's not all that law is about. And I have to say, giving tribute to law schools, is I'm very glad I went to law school. It took me a while to decide to do it. I was doing other things before I went to law school. I didn't get there till I was in my mid-20s, and I'm really glad I did, because it broadened. It focused my mind, but it also broadened my imagination and the scope of my thinking much more than I thought, and it still does. I still think a bit like a lawyer, but not just like a lawyer. As you can tell from some of my answers, I think a bit historically. I think a bit, more broadly politically, but I do think like a lawyer a lot, and that's not a bad thing. And because it does give you a certain precision and focus. But it also gives you, which is helpful to have that discipline. But not all the answers the best hours in your life are not going to be billable. So just remember that.
Thank you so much. That's really great to hear that you still use some of those skills today. I'm 2 months out, so if you were to tell me it was a waste of time, that'd be very unfortunate. So thank you so much, Ambassador Ray, for all of your thoughtful remarks. It's been really great to get your perspective on all these issues. So I do want to open it now to the audience for our general Q&A session. So I just want to let everyone know you can ask Ambassador Ray your questions one of two ways, or I guess both ways. If you have multiple questions, you can either use the raise hand function in the reactions tab of Zoom, and you can unmute yourself when called upon, or you can type your questions in the chat. My colleagues with the International Law Society are monitoring the chat, and we'll be grouping questions, and I'll flip back and forth between the two. So we already have some hands raised. So I will let Michael Demjanovic go first.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Ray. Quick question for me. Could you please speak a little bit on the relationship between NATO and any potential motivation for Russian involvement in Ukraine?
I think the Russian preoccupation is with two different things. I think the first one is they're making it very clear to NATO that there are limits to how far they will allow their borders to be an area of conflict from their perspective. I don't agree with their perspective, but I think that's what I would call the security issue, is one that they've raised, and I think you have to take that at face value. I think there's been some Western response to that. Second is much more complicated, and that is the whole issue around the very existence and identity of Ukraine as something that exists separate from that of Russia. Russia is an imperial country with an imperial history and an imperial past and frankly present. And the Russians are having a great deal of challenge accepting the independence, the sovereignty, and the nature of the democratic potential for a country like Ukraine. And it's very clear by President Putin, and you can read it, what he wrote. I mean, he wrote an article that came out this summer on this question of the existence of Ukraine as something separate from Russia. And he makes it very clear that he doesn't think Ukraine has a separate identity from Russia. He makes it very clear that he considers Ukrainian and Russian history to be so intertwined that anything else is an occupation by the West of Ukraine. It's not a genuine Ukrainian thing. And as long as he has that view, I think we're going to have a considerable amount of tension in the relationship between NATO, if you like, and Ukraine. I don't think my own assessment is that the right of Ukraine to ask to join NATO is always possible, but whether that's something that's on the horizon, I think is entirely debatable for a whole variety of reasons. And so I think that that's a bit of a subterfuge on the part of the Russians. They know that. No one is, the issue is not in front of NATO at the moment. It's not something that's, imminent. I think really the concern rather is seeing a democratic, functioning, different kind of society challenging Russian sovereignty over their country is, I think, a very important part of the threat. And that frankly is part of what the Minsk agreements are about, 1 and 2, both Minsk agreements. And it's dealing with the implication of what an independent Ukraine really means. And I think that's a sort of the psychological, if you like, source of the challenge.
Thank you, Michael, for the question. Andrew, you're next.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Ambassador Ray. It's been a fascinating talk, and thanks to UNB for pulling this together. Just curious around sort of the future of the Foreign Service. I spent nearly a decade in the Foreign Service, and obviously, I mean, for Canada to lead internationally, we've got to have a strong Foreign Service. So I'd love to hear your views about just what you think we need to do to build a Foreign Service for the future.
Well, it's a big, again, a lot of these questions are like forever questions. Well, I come at it from two perspectives. One of this is that I grew up as a Foreign Service kid, right? So my dad was in the Foreign Service for 40 years, and we traveled together as a family. And he was part of the Foreign Service when it was very small. When he joined the Foreign Service, there would not have been more than 25 or 30 officers. And it grew during the Second World War, and then after the war it grew. And of course, now there's several hundred thousands of officers and employees of the Foreign Service. I think the problem is the challenge of any ordered service like the Foreign Service is the assumption is sort of like the Gilbert and Sullivan song. You know, I polished up the handle so carefully that now I am the ruler of the Queen's Navy. I mean, the idea that you start at the bottom of the system and you work your way up to the top, and then you're at the top, and that's okay and hierarchical, fairly siloed, you know, very disciplined in some very important respects, which are very, very good. And I also come at it from the perspective of somebody who's here now as a Foreign Service officer, but I'm not a product of the Foreign Service in the sense I didn't work in the Foreign Service for my career. So for many Foreign Service officers, I'm considered to be an outsider, you know, a political appointment, which I appreciate fully and say, yes, I mean, I am what I am. I'm not, I can't pretend to be something that I'm not, but we shouldn't devalue other things that you can do to contribute to where you got to be. There are some skill sets that you develop that are actually quite helpful that, you know, arguably, as you say, well, you don't have quite the same experiences that I do. So I come at it with some strengths as well as some weaknesses. I think the key thing is to, a couple of things. One is really to value the experience of international engagement, and understand that there's a variety of ways in which that can be expressed, but also understand its importance and its significance, and a sense of professionalism, of being nonpartisan, of being objective as possible, and giving straightforward advice to the government of the day in a way that's unvarnished and as clear as possible. But the second is one that says there's nothing wrong with bringing in people from the outside. I do think that bureaucracies which do not kind of engage in allowing people to move around more and appreciating and valuing other experiences which are slightly different from that of the existing Foreign Service, I think that's actually quite healthy and in fact necessary in order to allow change to happen. So there is a future, but it's a very bright future, frankly, but it's going to be a little bit different, I would suspect, partly driven by the impact of technology and the importance of creating organizations that are flatter and less hierarchical in their structures, which I think is essential.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for the question. There is a question in the chat just before we go back to the hands raised for Ambassador Ray. What do you think the most effective means are to achieve peacekeeping, or at the very least, the most effective means of some aspects of human security? Is it policy? Is it invoking treaties? And what has, in your experience, been the most effective in delivering tangible results?
Well, I think peace building, but creating conditions that make for peace and preventing conflict is really how I think we have to start from that premise. And I think the UN itself is changing how it looks at the relationship between all of these things. The romance of peacekeeping, if you like, has been that we neutral police officers, international constabulary, if you like, goes out and prevents two warring parties from fighting with each other and sets up the conditions under which peace will be maintained. The real world is much, much more complicated than that. A lot of the breakdowns that we see in societies are within those societies, not between countries, although there are conflicts between countries, of course. But the internal conflicts are very complex. Some of them are related to terrible economic conditions, to long-standing ethnic conflicts within countries that have been created by colonial powers over many, many generations. And the response of the UN system has to become much more diffuse through the system. So it's partly about development, it's partly involving the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and other, international financial institutions to engage in more successfully in creating the conditions for development. How to get the UN system working with women and men and young people in dialogue. So we do a lot more conflict prevention, a lot more early intervention, looking at peace building, and then finally military intervention if authorized by the Security Council. But for all the reasons that I've described, that doesn't happen that often. When it does, the conflicts that the UN is involved in now are not, you're not keeping the peace. There is no peace to keep. You are trying to deal with the origins of some very difficult and deep-seated conflicts. And it's very, 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 very tough. And that's what we're experiencing. The world of peacekeeping today is not, as I said, it's not the Cypresses or the Suezes where you were simply there to kind of act as an international police force. It's much, much more complex. And the complexity of Canada's engagement is quite broad. People say, well, Canada's not doing any peacekeeping. You say, well, we certainly are. We're doing it in Latvia. We're doing it in the Indo-Pacific. We're doing it in a number of different places. We're not in Latvia because the UN is there, because the Russians would veto anybody going into Latvia. But we're there in Latvia because Latvia is a member of NATO. So our peacekeeping profile is changing as the world changes, and that shouldn't be a source of surprise. Our economic and political engagement in peacekeeping is very substantial. My colleague, Richard Arbeiter, who's deputy PR here, he chairs the committee on peacekeeping at the UN. Canada has always chaired that committee, and it's always the number 2 Canadian ambassador who chairs it. And it's a very, very important part of our overall coordination of the work of the UN in the peacekeeping, peace building field. An Assistant Secretary General was just appointed on peace building, a Canadian, Elizabeth Spahar. She's very much involved in that now. So we have many reasons to keep our engagement going, and particularly now we're doing far more in looking at women in security and women peacekeepers, and how to broaden the concept of the engagement of women in the resolution of conflict, which is a very important part of our engagement.
Absolutely. Mark, you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It's good to see you again. And I think as we're listening to your answers, I don't want to make this political, but you're going on quite a range of topics here, and your remarkable answers make us all think, or at least me, that you could be called the best prime minister we never had. So we're certainly glad to have you in your current role. So I was going to ask you about Ukraine, but I think you've talked about that. So I wanted to ask you about China. And, I was interested in your comments about you and your colleagues at the UN acting as a sounding board almost for Ottawa and what's happening in Ukraine. I'm wondering, during the Two Michaels saga, was this also a role that you took up? And what do you see as the current state of Canada's relationship with China and where it's going to go forward?
Our role at the UN on these disputes and these issues is a little bit like, think of an iceberg, right? Most of the iceberg is under the water. Most of what we do is not on the record. There are informal conversations that we have with each other. And certainly I was in constant contact with Ambassador Barton, who was our ambassador in China, now retired, and as well as with a number of other ambassadors, and our office in our political offices in Ottawa, as well as with a number of diplomats here at the UN, including the Chinese. We were not the center of attention. We were not the principal, part of it, but we were very much part of the conversation. And I hope we were constructive and helpful in talking to everybody. I mean, part of what we do here at the UN is we talk to people, even the people that are difficult to talk to another capital because we don't have diplomatic relations with them, or our relationships are very strained. And we also did some public diplomacy in which occasionally I would spar with the Chinese representatives who would make some comment, and I would just say that we're having nothing of it, because you can't compare the treatment of Madame Meng in Vancouver to the treatment of the two Michaels in China. So it was, whenever they would try that number on us, I would respond vigorously to that, which I think is also part of the job. I think the relationship with China is very complicated at the moment, but I don't think it's confined. I don't think we're the only ones who are facing this, the challenge and the transformation. The transformation of Chinese society in the last 40 years, since 1980, since the real revolutionary in China is Deng Xiaoping, and when he said, we're going to develop ourselves, we're going to develop our economy, we're going to get rid of our internal conflicts, and we're going to allow people to make a living, we're going to encourage farmers to become profitable, we're going to get rid of some of the excessive collectivization in our economy, we're going to move it forward in a different way. That transformation started in 1980, and it's not stopped. It's moved exponentially. And it is, I think, one of the most dramatic transformations of an economy and of a society in the last several hundred years that we've ever seen. We've never seen anything like the pace and the extent of the transformation. It is quite literally an extraordinary event of our time. And that creation of a new power, of a real economic power, is bound to create issues because it's such a huge deal. I mean, China in the 1970s was politically, everybody had their little red book, but economically it was weak and poor. And China is no longer weak and it's no longer poor. And I don't think we should be hoping for a return to either poverty or weakness for the Chinese people. I think their prosperity is something that we should recognize as an extremely positive event for the world. However, we're now seeing in the last while the centralization of power again in the person of President Xi. We're seeing more broadly kind of imperial approach to their neighborhood, which we're seeing in the South China Sea. We're seeing, I think, a determination to exercise power and influence through what they call the Belt and Road Initiative, which some critics have described it as a Belt and Noose Initiative, but it certainly creates powerful relationships between China and the economy of the world and the economic situation in a number of countries. And here at the UN, we see the Chinese are taking greater interest in how every part of the system operates, every aspect of it. China is the second largest donor on peacekeeping. They are donors not only of money, but also of troops. They are spreading their influence and their power in ways that we have never seen before in the global system. Again, I think it's taken some people by surprise, but I think we should wake up and say, yes, this is happening. It's not something to say, the Chinese are, quote, it's not as if they're taking over the world, but they are determined to take their place, what they see as their place. And I think the challenge for us and for all non-authoritarian governments is that we don't want the world to be made safe for autocracy because of the impact that autocracy has on the spirit of a people, on people's human rights, on people's ability to be themselves and to be able to express themselves freely and to have a genuine rule of law that it really does work, is effective. And I think that is part of the challenge that we face, is that it's not about another Cold War. It is about a conflict of perspectives and values, and yes, to an extent of power, that will play itself out in various ways. It's playing itself out in Ukraine now between the Russians and the Ukrainians. It's playing itself out in the South China Sea. It's playing it out potentially in the conflict potential between China and Taiwan. And I don't think Canada or Western countries can remove themselves from the significance of that issue. But we do have to engage with China. And China is a permanent part of the global economy. And it's not like, one of the main differences between this situation and the Cold War with the Russians is that there was no substantial economic relationship between Russia and the West. Russia has never really been a significant economic power. Russia's power has been expressed militarily and politically, and because it became a nuclear power, because of its power to spread its ideology and under Stalin and later leaders. But this is a very different situation. Our supply lines are deeply embedded in the Chinese economy. That's not something you can just turn off like that. It doesn't work that way. Sorry, one other thing about China, just to complete this. The other thing is that China is now the biggest emitter of carbon emissions in the world. So if we're going to deal with climate change, China has to be directly involved and implicated. And so that creates a completely different set of incentives and relationships with China. We can't solve the climate change crisis without China. It can't possibly be done.
Thank you, Ambassador Ray. I think we'll just do one more quick question if you still have some time. Joseph, you've had your hand up for a while, so you can go ahead.
Hi, Bob, it's Joe Ingram.
Hi, Joe.
How are you? Listen, a quick question. As you well know, all UN member governments have endorsed, and you mentioned human rights a few moments ago, have endorsed UN charters and conventions on human rights, and tacitly recognizing that it is an essential public good, especially in the 21st century, and yet effective and neutral implementation powers have not been institutionalized yet within the UN, within any UN bodies. And I'm curious, is Canada active in promoting the establishment of an international human rights tribunal, where the UN, and there are some proposing this, mutual friends, where the UN membership in effect would be made, where it would be made a requirement under a revised UN charter. UN membership would require that member country be part of and accept the sovereignty of an international human rights tribunal. Have you, or is the Canadian government at all involved in this initiative?
Not per se, no. I think that there's a lot of discussion about how do we strengthen the capacity of different UN institutions to deal with issues of human rights. I think essentially what you're talking about would be a new organization that would be in a sense outside the UN, where people would voluntarily say, yes, we're going to join this tribunal, which will have jurisdiction over us. It's very important to remember as we start pointing fingers that the UN is a product of, as I've said, of this tension between the rule of law and human rights and power politics. It's also, legally speaking, it's a tension between the rights of sovereign states and principles of international law and international jurisdiction. Without sounding too professorial, this is a hell of a question. This is a really complex question. we have been and are and remain the strongest advocates for the International Criminal Court, of which I'm a vice president of the Assembly of States Parties. We're very much involved in trying to revive the capacity of the WTO to function as an effective binding body of law. And where the United States has never joined the ICC, and the United States is under President Trump, did everything in their power to undermine the capacity of the WTO. And we know from our own bilateral disputes with the United States, for example, on softwood lumber, that the Americans do not readily accept the jurisdiction of a treaty or of a binding agreement, and insist on the sovereignty of their own national institutions. So the kind of thing that you're talking about, an international human rights tribunal that would have jurisdiction, clear binding jurisdiction over the behavior of other countries, is not something that any of the permanent members of the UN would accept as something that they would like to see happen, because they insist on their ability to opt out of anything they don't like. If they don't like what the ICC is doing, they say, well, we're not in the ICC. Why can't we have an effective response to the genocide, to genocide as it's alleged and I believe happened in Myanmar? And we go to the ICC, International Court of Justice, who can issue an opinion, but as a result of that opinion can't do anything. And the ICC could do something, but you have to be a signatory to the Rome Treaty in order to become subject to the jurisdiction of the ICC. So yet we're in the middle of this fight. This is a transformative issue that will, I think, be at the center of political and economic and legal discussions for the foreseeable future. It'll certainly be very much part of the future of the younger people who are in the audience today, because it's very much an ongoing issue of the evolution of international law and international institutions. One thing I would say at the end, Joe, is to say I would recommend that everyone read, once again, the speech that Winston Churchill gave in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. Churchill, that speech is famous for when Churchill described the nature of the Iron Curtain that was coming down in the middle of Europe and that was creating the split in the Cold War. But there's a lot of other things in that speech which are very, very noteworthy. The most important one of which he said, it's one thing to have courts. It's another thing to have a constabulary that can enforce what the courts say. And Churchill strongly said, we think we need more. And he was willing to stick his neck out and say, there has to be a stronger UN military capacity to respond independent of the interests of the great powers in situations that would create the peace. And that never happened. So I think it's a speech worth reading because it's very, very clear about this connection between law and enforcement. And without getting too far astray here, we're experiencing this in Canada at the moment. It's one thing to say this is what the law is, another thing to say this is how we're going to enforce it. And I think that's a challenge that we face internally from time to time, and globally. That is the central challenge that we face at the moment.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Ray, and thank you everyone for your questions. I actually worked at the Trade Law Bureau this summer on the softwood lumber dispute, so it's a little triggering for me. If anyone's wondering if that's still an ongoing case, it is. So I am mindful of the time, and I do understand, Ambassador Ray, you have an engagement after. So I do just want to say a couple of thank yous. Of course, first and foremost, Ambassador Ray, thank you so much again for joining us as this year's Speaker of the Year. We are honored to have you to hear your thoughtful remarks and perspectives and sharing your experiences with us, as well as thank you to your team. Sophie and Megan and Barbara and everyone at Canada's mission to the UN in New York have been a vital part of putting this event together. So we are so thankful for them as well. I do also just want to say a quick thank you to the rest of my executive members, especially Bridget Martin, who has been another vital part of the team for putting this event together, calling at late points of the night to organize this. She's always available. So I do want to say a special thank you to her and the rest of my team, as well as the administration at UNB Law, Dean Marin, Ed Bowes, David Anderson, Alicia Cook, and much more, who have all been very helpful today in setting everything up and promoting the event. And last but not least, I want to say a very special thank you to all of you who have registered and attended the event today, and everyone who asked your questions and engaged with Ambassador Ray. It's been such a wonderful event, and I'm so happy to have been able to host it and put it on for everyone. So again, thank you so much, Ambassador Ray, and we hope to hear from you very soon again, and hopefully you'll be able to take up Dean Marin's offer on coming to see us in person when it's safe to do so.
Thank you so much. It's been great. I really enjoyed it. It's been great to be with everybody, and appreciate the range of questions and the chance to respond to all of you, and for your kind comments. Thank you very, very much. It's been a great honor to be your speaker this year, and I'm delighted to have been able to join you.
Of course. Thank you so much again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. All the best to you. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.